God, I said, what have I done that has earned me the privilege of introducing Bryan Stevenson 3 times in my life? I must say that in a humbling way because of the man that he is. I know that he needs no introduction, but he absolutely deserves one and more. As we know, Bryan has been given awards for not just his writings and not just his representation of the condemned, but also for his humanitarian efforts. And we appreciate all of the things that he does for the clients that we serve each and every day. We also want to take this opportunity to thank your entire team for the work that is done around the world and the millions of lives that you changed and shifted. We want to thank Bryan for taking time out of his schedule to be with us. We want to thank him for the lives that he saved. We want to thank him in advance for changing our lives today. Bryan, we came to Montgomery to lead with fire in our bellies. We know that your time with us today will be that last bit of kindle that we need to leave fired up. So without further ado, ladies and gentlemen, Bryan Stevenson.
Very, very kind. I'm just so thrilled and honored that all of you who are doing such critical, necessary, urgent work around this country would choose to come to Montgomery and spend time in deep conversation, important conversation about critical issues that relate to race and justice. I get really emotional when I think about the community of people that you represent, because you are the frontline workers for preserving justice in this country. And doing the work that you do is undervalued, it's underappreciated. There aren't the kind of narratives that there should be to explore and explain how vital it is that the poor, the vulnerable, have someone with them, have some assistance facing these structures and systems. So I'm just honored that you're here and really thrilled that you had a chance to spend time in the conversations that you've had and at our sites. And I thought what I would do this morning is just talk a little bit about why we have created the Legacy Museum and why we've created the National Memorial. And just to kind of give some voice to kind of where I am in this process, because like many of you, I believe in rights, and I'm organized and oriented to do work to enforce rights on behalf of disfavored people. I am a product of Brown versus Board of Education. I grew up in a community where black children could not go to the public schools. I lived in a county where there were no high schools for black kids when my dad was a teenager. And even though he was smart and hardworking, he couldn't go to high school. And he was denied opportunities to achieve progress and economic stability and wealth because he didn't have the degree he needed to take advantage of a lot of opportunities. And then these lawyers came into our community and made them open up the public schools. And because these lawyers were able to open up those schools, I got to go to the public schools. I got to go to high school. And there should be no confusion about this. The county I grew up in was 80% white. If you had a vote on whether to end racial segregation, black people would have lost that vote because the white people in the community did not want their children going to school with kids like me. But these lawyers had the power to enforce the Supreme Court's ruling in Brown versus Board of Education, and that allowed them to push those doors open, and disfavored people like me and the people in my community walked through those doors and had opportunities that our parents and grandparents had been denied. I went to college thinking about the power lawyers have to protect the vulnerable, the marginalized, the people in a democracy who will never achieve the benefits of that democratic system. And that's what motivated me to go to law school. And I'll be honest, and those of you who've heard me talk, it was challenging when I got to law school because I went to Harvard and it didn't seem like anybody was talking about race or the poor or social justice. And I found myself really disillusioned during my time in law school. I left after the first year, ended up going over to the School of Government to get a degree in public policy. I thought I'd find something more resonant there, and I remember the day during my time at the School of Government when I woke up and I looked in the mirror and I thought, wow, I'm even more miserable here than I was at the law school. And I remember going back to the law school and trying to reconcile myself to a career as a lawyer that was not in harmony with the vision, with the dreams I had when I went to law school. And it was in the midst of that crisis that I took a course that required me to get proximate to condemned people. I went to Georgia to work with the Southern Center for Human Rights, and I saw this community of lawyers who were deeply engaged by the work that they were doing. They were my first exposure to defender-type roles. And these lawyers got up early in the morning. They worked hard all day. They stayed up late at night. And I began to remember those lawyers that had come into our community to open up the school doors. And I began to find passion and energy and hope. And then they asked me to go to death row and meet someone they hadn't had time to meet. And I remember being so nervous, and I got in my car and I drove down to meet this man. And they just explained to me, said, just tell him that he's not at risk of execution anytime in the next year, and that somebody will get down as soon as possible. And I remember going to Jackson, Georgia, parking my car, going into death row. I'd never been to a maximum security prison before, walking inside this prison. The guards were very hostile and angry and disrespectful, and they took me back to the visitation room, and I was just getting really anxious and nervous and worried. And I know a lot of you can relate to this kind of first encounter with some of these structures and systems, and they put me in that room, and I was just terrified that the man who came out to meet me would be disappointed when he discovered that I didn't know very much. So I tried to rehearse exactly what I was going to say, and finally they opened the door, and there stood the first condemned man I'd ever seen. And what I remember about him is how he was burdened with chains. He had handcuffs on his wrist. He had a chain around his waist. He had shackles on his ankles. It took them 10 minutes to unchain him. And when he finally walked over, I was so nervous that I forgot all the things I rehearsed. And I just said, I'm so sorry. I'm just a law student. I don't know much about the death penalty. I don't know much about criminal procedure. I don't know much about civil procedure, appellate procedure. I probably won't be able to answer any of your questions, but they sent me down here to tell you that you're not at risk of execution anytime in the next year. And as soon as I said that, the man said, wait, say that again. I said, you're not at risk of execution anytime in the next year. And the man said, wait, say that again. I said, you're not at risk of execution anytime in the next year. And that's when this man grabbed my hands and he said, thank you. He said, you're the first person I've met who's not a death row prisoner or a death row guard in the 2 years I've been on death row. He said, because of you, I'm going to see my wife and kids. I've been talking to my wife and kids on the phone, but I haven't let them come and visit because I was afraid I'd have an execution date, and I didn't want them to have to deal with it. He said, because of you, I'm going to see my wife, I'm going to see my kids. He said, thank you. And I couldn't believe how, even in my ignorance, being proximate, being present, could have an impact on the quality of someone's life. That man hugged me. And we started talking, and it turned out we were exactly the same age. We had the same birthday, same month, same day, same year. He started asking me questions about my life. I asked him questions about his life. I was only scheduled to be there an hour, but we just kept talking. It was so rich, and we were deep in this conversation. It was a discovery for both of us, and 1 hour turned to 2 hours, 2 hours turned to 3 hours, and we were still talking. The guards were waiting outside to end the visit, and after 3 hours, they'd gotten angry. And they just were furious that I hadn't ended the visit, so they couldn't take it any longer, so they came bursting into the room, and they opened the doors, and they ran over to this man, and they threw him against the wall. And they pulled his arms back, and they put the handcuffs on his wrists so tightly I could see the metal pinching his skin. They were treating him really roughly. And I said, no, it's not his fault, it's my fault. I stayed too long. He didn't do anything wrong, but they ignored me. They wrapped the chains around his waist, they put the shackles back on his ankles, and they began shoving him roughly toward the door, and I was just devastated. I said, please, it's not his fault, it's my fault. I stayed too late, but they ignored me. And I remember them shoving this man, pushing this man violently toward the door. I remember when they got him in front of the door, how he planted his feet. And then when they tried to push him through the door, He didn't move. And that's when this man turned around and he looked at me. He said, "Bryan, don't worry about this. You just come back." And that's when he did this thing I've never forgotten. He stood there, he closed his eyes, he threw his head back, and that's when he started to sing. And he started singing this hymn I hadn't heard in a long time. He started singing, "I'm pressing on the upward way. New heights I'm gaining every day, still praying as I'm onward bound." And then he said, "Lord, plant my feet on higher ground." Everybody stopped. The guards were covered. And they started pushing him down the hallway. And you could hear the chains clanging, but you could also hear this man singing about higher ground. And when I heard that man sing, everything changed for me. That was the moment that I realized I wanted to help condemned people get to higher ground. But more than that, that was the moment that I realized that my journey to higher ground was tied to his journey. I realized that if he doesn't get there, I can't get there. And it changed me. I went back to Harvard Law School, a completely different law student. You couldn't get me out of the law school after that. I needed to know everything about comedy and criminal procedure and federalism. I needed to know all of the doctrines that might empower me to help condemned people get to higher ground. And I tell people this all the time. If I've had any impact as a lawyer, if I've helped anybody during the course of my career, if I've made a difference for any of the clients that I serve, it's not because I'm hardworking or smart or bright or anything like it. It's because I got close enough to a condemned man to hear him sing about a higher ground. And the power we have is that we are close enough to people who have been accused, who have been menaced, who have been traumatized, who have been beaten and been broken, to appreciate the humanity and the dignity that they still possess. And even though it can be overwhelming, and even though it can be challenging, our power is in our willingness to go into the places that too few will go. And I want to affirm the importance of that. Because when we are proximate to the vulnerable, when we are proximate to the condemned, when we're proximate to communities and people that have been marginalized, we begin to see things that others don't see. You see, we have too many policymakers in this country creating and making policies from a distance. Our laws have been shaped by legislators, disconnected from the problems of the poor, disconnected from the challenges that we see in communities of color. And that disconnect has allowed them to create laws that are unfair and unjust. We've been governed by people who've been creating punishments in this country as if we can put crimes in jails and prisons. When you read these debates they have in legislatures, when you look at the way they talk about the way we're going to enforce criminal law, they are talking as if you can put a robbery in a jail or prison. You can put a sex crime in a jail or prison. You can put a murder in a jail or prison. And what we know is that you cannot put crimes in jails and prisons. You can only put people in jails and prisons. And people are not crimes. They're not. And we have to make the world remember that people are not crimes. Yes, they can commit crimes. Yes, there can be a legitimate need for accountability, even punishment. But when we forget that people are not crimes, we get distorted, and our system has been distorted by these false ideas. But when we're proximate, we see the beauty, the humanity, the dignity, the importance of fighting against the excess. I am still persuaded that the critical role that some of us have to play at this point in American history is that we have to get closer to communities where they're suffering, closer to places where people are dealing with trauma and neglect, closer to the mentally ill, closer to children, closer to those who've been disfavored. You know, I talk about my grandmother a lot. My grandmother taught me something when I was a young kid. When integration came to our community, my grandmother started doing these things she hadn't done before. I had one of those classic African-American matriarchs. My grandmother was tough. My grandmother was strong. But my grandmother was kind, and she was loving, and she had this spirit and energy that just kind of drew you to her. She was the daughter of people who were enslaved. Her parents were born in slavery. And the experience of being raised by people who had survived slavery absolutely shaped my grandmother's worldview. And she just had this powerful aura. And she was the end of every argument in our family. She was the start of a lot of arguments in our family. And when integration came, my grandmother was really worried about me. she would kind of say this thing, oh, I don't know, I'm worried about what's going to happen. And she started doing this thing she hadn't done before. She would come up to me and she'd give me these hugs. And she would squeeze me so tightly, I thought she was trying to hurt me. And then she'd see me an hour later and she'd say, Bryan, do you still feel me hugging you? And if I said no, she would choke me. So by the time I was 10, my grandmother taught me every time I would see her, the first thing I would say, Mama, I always feel you hugging me. And she'd smile this smile, and I didn't appreciate what she was trying to teach me until much later. My grandmother worked as a domestic her whole life. She lived into her 90s. But when she got into her 90s, she fell one day, and she broke her hip. And then she was diagnosed with cancer. And my grandmother was dying. I was in college at the time, and I just couldn't imagine living in a world without her. And I remember going to see her knowing it was going to be my last conversation. And, I guess I've always been just a little verbal, and I persuaded myself that if I kept talking with my grandmother, she wouldn't die. And I sat there next to her, and I held her hand, and I just kept talking and talking. Mama, you remember when this? I was going on and on and on. And her eyes were closed. She wasn't responding. I wasn't even sure she could hear me. But for that time period, I felt like if I kept talking, she wouldn't die. And at some point, I realized I couldn't do this forever, and I was going to have to go. And I stood up, and I was about to take a step, and that's when my grandmother opened her eyes. And then she squeezed my hand, and she looked at me. And the last thing she said to me, she said, Bryan, do you still feel me hugging you? And then she said, I want you to know I'm always going to be hugging you. And I didn't appreciate the power of those words then, but I appreciate them now, because there have been times in my life when I have felt the embrace of my grandmother and what she represents, that whole generation of people who struggled and survived. And the power we have as people who are willing to get proximate to the accused, the condemned, the neglected, the imprisoned, the disfavored. The power we have is that sometimes we are close enough to wrap our arms around people whose dignity has been denied, whose humanity has been questioned, who have been pushed down by systems that are unjust and unfair, who have been wrongly condemned, wrongly abused, wrongly mistreated. We have the privilege of standing close enough sometimes to wrap our arms around them and affirm their humanity and their dignity. Sometimes I feel like when I go into court, what I'm doing is trying to give my client a hug to affirm his humanity, her dignity. And I want to do it in front of other people so that they can see what I see. And that is the power, that's the gift, that's the privilege we have. I don't have any second thoughts about the career I've had standing next to the poor, standing next to the accused, fighting for the rights of those who have been disfavored. And we began our work representing people on death row, and many of you know our kind of story. We began broadening the client communities. I realized by the 90s that actually doing work on death penalty cases, it was hard to expand rights because there was such hostility. The politics around the death penalty were so perverse that we actually got less justice, less opportunity for review. So we began expanding. We started representing other vulnerable populations, the intellectually disabled, people with mental illness, children. And we began representing children because I was really concerned about the way in which our policymakers, once again, distant from our neediest children, were creating these narratives about kids. They were saying that some kids aren't kids, that some children look like kids and sound like kids, but they're not really children. And these policymakers actually allowed criminologists to go into legislative bodies and policy-making policies and tell the lie that some children aren't children, some children are, quote, super predators. And that label was used to demonize a generation of children. And you all remember when this happened. They began lowering the minimum age for trying children as adults. Every state in the country made it easier to put young children in adult jails and prisons. We started criminalizing our schools. We hired teachers that talk to children like the teachers are correctional officers. We hired principals that talk to children like the principals are wardens. We threatened and punished and abused these young kids. And I could go on and on about the problems that we're having in our schools. We have an epidemic of trauma in poor communities throughout this country. Many of you work with clients from zip codes where 70–80% of the children in those communities are going to end up in jails and prisons. And that's in part because they're born into violent families. They live in violent neighborhoods. They're surrounded by argument and conflict and menace and threat, and no one hugs them. No one cares for them. No one affirms their beauty. No one tells them that they can be anything that they want to be. And when you're a small person surrounded by conflict and violence, your brain begins to produce the chemicals that all of our brains produce when we are threatened. If somebody came into this auditorium with a machine gun and threatened to kill us all, each of us would start producing cortisol and adrenaline in our brains to help us cope with the threat that's presented. And if that threat were eliminated, we'd have some time to get back to normal. And some of us would get back pretty soon, in a couple of hours. Others of us, it might take days. For some of us, just that incident of being threatened might take weeks or months before we got to normal levels, depending on our prior exposure to threat and menace. And what's, of course, happening to our combat veterans when they go abroad, they're being threatened and menaced so often that the brain finally says, you know what, let's just produce these chemicals all the time. It's not safe for us to not keep this person in this readiness, this hyper-responsive, hyperactive state of mind. And these combat veterans come back traumatized by a post-traumatic stress disorder that undermines their ability to have healthy relationships, to be calm, to be normal, to be in the place that they are intended to be. And the way we treat post-traumatic stress disorder is to create an environment where we can help that veteran, that traumatized person feel safe. If we can create an environment where they feel safe long enough, the brain might stop producing the chemicals and that person can recover. Well, what happens to children is the same thing. And we have thousands of children in this country who by the time they're 4 and 5 have elevated levels of these chemicals in their brain because they're constantly being threatened and menaced. They have a trauma disorder. And when they go to school, that trauma disorder isn't treated, it's aggravated by these teachers and these menacing police officers and these principals that actually aggravate the trauma by threatening them some more. Right. They say, do this and we'll suspend you, do that and we'll expel you. And when you're constantly being threatened like that, you're looking for a place to feel safe. And so when somebody comes along at 8 or 9 and says, look, I got some drugs, I tried this, it made me feel okay for a few hours. What do? You take the drugs. And after you have that 3-hour, 4-hour period where you're not feeling threatened and menaced, what do you want? You want more of that. And we don't provide opportunities or options for these children to have safer ways to feel less menaced and threatened. And then if they get old enough, 10, 11, 12, and somebody says, I know exactly what you're going through, you feel threatened and menaced, you're worried about this, you're worried about that, we have a gang, and our gang will help you make you feel safe. Join the gang. What do? They join the gang. And instead of seeing that as an indicator of trauma and distress, of dysfunction and disfavored communities and people not being served, we see it as an indicator of a bad child. And then we add to the punishment that these young kids get when they engage in behaviors that are unhealthy. And that kind of narrative has so corrupted our society that we've got to begin changing that narrative. We've got to begin pushing against that narrative. We've got to find ways to get people closer to what we see. We have all of these states. Even today, there are 13 states with no minimum age of trying a child as an adult. And some of you know what I'm talking about. I've represented 9 and 10-year-old kids facing 50 and 60-year prison sentences in adult prisons. I've represented 13 and 14-year-old children sentenced to die in prison, life without parole, for non-homicide offenses. And it's tragic, and it's heartbreaking. I tell this story about a child I represented some years ago. He lived in a household where his mother was the victim frequently of domestic violence, and the boy's mother had a boyfriend. And when the man would start drinking, he'd get violent. And this man started drinking, and he came home one day, and he went into the kitchen. He called the boy's mother into the kitchen. She didn't say anything. He just walked over to her, and he punched her in the face because he was angry, because he was intoxicated. And she fell, and she hit her head as she fell. She ended up on the floor bleeding and unconscious. This little boy came running into the kitchen to help his mom. He saw her on the floor bleeding and unconscious. He tried to stop the bleeding. He tried to revive her. And after 10 minutes, this little boy thought his mom was dead. She wasn't dead, but he thought she was dead. The man had gone into a bedroom and he'd fallen asleep. And the little boy got up, he was going to call the police, he was going to call an ambulance, and then he remembered that this man kept a handgun in his dresser drawer. And so the man went over to the drawer, and he opened the drawer, and he pulled out the gun, and he walked over to where the little boy was, where this man was sleeping. And he pointed the gun at the man's head. And he just stood there. And the man was snoring, and at some point the man stopped snoring, and he jumped. And when the man jumped, the little boy jumped, and when the little boy jumped, he pulled the trigger and ended up shooting that man in the head, killing him instantly. It was tragic. This little boy was very small for his age. He was under 5 feet tall, he weighed less than 100 pounds. He'd never been in trouble before. He was the kind of kid that might have been tried as a juvenile because he had no prior juvenile adjudications. He was a decent student, a pretty good history. He wasn't great, so he had a decent history. He was the kind of kid that might have been tried as a juvenile, but for the fact that the man that he shot and killed, his mother's boyfriend, well, that man was a deputy sheriff. And because he was a deputy sheriff, the prosecutor insisted that this child be tried as an adult. And the judge certified him to stand trial as an adult, and they immediately placed him in the adult jail. He'd been there 3 days before I got involved in the case, and I went to see this little boy, and it was one of those encounters that I know some of you have had, but I was worried from the second I saw him. He walked into the visitation room, and he looked terrified. He sat down, I started asking him questions, and no matter what I asked him, he wouldn't say anything, he just sat there. And I finally put my pen down and said, look, I can't help you if you don't talk to me. You gotta talk to me. The little boy wouldn't say anything. I got up, I walked around the table, I pulled my chair close and said, come on, you gotta talk to me. I can't help if you don't talk to me. And the little boy was just staring at the wall. He wouldn't say a word. And I couldn't figure out what to do. And at some point, I just leaned on him. And when I leaned on him, he leaned back. And when he leaned back, I put my arm around him. And I said, come on, you gotta talk to me. I can't help if you don't talk to me. And that's when the little boy started to cry. And through his tears, he began talking to me, not about what happened with the man, not about what happened with his mom, but he started talking to me about what had happened at the jail. And he told me on the first night in the jail, several men had hurt him. Then he told me on the next night he'd been raped by several people. Then he told me on the night before I'd gotten there, so many people had hurt him that he couldn't remember how many there had been. And I held that little boy while he cried hysterically for almost an hour. And people don't realize what it's like to be with people just utterly crushed by the tragedy and the terror that they are experiencing. And I finally got that young man calm, and I said, look, I'm going to get you out of here. You stay right here. And I'll never forget that boy grabbing me by the arm and saying, please, please don't go. Please don't go. I said, no, it's all right. It's okay. I'm going to get you out of here. And I remember leaving the jail asking the question, who is responsible for this? And the answer, of course, is we are. We live in a country where we have disconnected ourselves from the most vulnerable children, where the children most at risk are most ignored. The Bureau of Justice projected that 1 in 3 black male babies born in this country is expected to go to jail or prison in 2001. And as tragic and devastating as that data point is, what's even more tragic is that no one said anything. We were indifferent to that phenomenon. There was no pandemic-like response. When it was announced that a third of the black male population was at risk of incarceration, expected to go to jails and prisons, there weren't interventions, there weren't conferences, there weren't federal task forces, there weren't emergency meetings. We just allowed it. And that allowance is a function of the distance and the narratives that have to change. I believe that all children are children. I don't think we make our commitment, we don't show our commitment to children in this country by looking at how well we treat talented kids and gifted kids and privileged kids. Our commitment to children has to be expressed by how well we treat poor kids, abused kids, disfavored kids. It's the kids that come into contact with the criminal legal system that are the ultimate measure of how we feel about children, which is why defenders should get all of the resources they need when they're trying to help a child. We shouldn't have to beg for money. For social workers and mental health workers and experts in trauma, we ought to collectively be doing everything we can to empower those standing next to the most vulnerable children in our society. And the reason why I'm saying all of this is that we are in the midst of a narrative crisis. And the critical work that we have to now do involves us becoming players in this narrative struggle. And I could talk all and on, but you already know the things that are reflective of the challenges that we face in our system. But about 12 years ago, when we were in the midst of doing all of that work, and I argued those cases at the U.S. Supreme Court, we won some bans on putting kids in prison for life with no parole. We made some progress. But in the midst of that, I had this really troubling insight, and it just kept me up. And what I realized about 12, 13 years ago is that I don't think we could win Brown versus Board of Education today. I don't think our court today would do something that disruptive on behalf of a disfavored group. And it made me worry about the next little Bryans coming up in our society. It made me deeply concerned that a generation of children were going to actually have less opportunities than I had to find their way. And that's when it became clear to me that we could not stay in court. We had to begin doing narrative work here at the EJI. And that's when we started turning our attention to this broad project of truth-telling about history. It is the process that has resulted in that museum and that memorial. I realized that if we don't begin talking more honestly about our history of racial injustice, no matter what else we do, we are going to fail to create the kind of justice that we want. We are burdened in this country by a history of racial injustice. It's like a toxin in the air. It is every bit as devastating and threatening and menacing as the coronavirus. It's everywhere. And it doesn't matter whether you're in California or Mississippi or New England or the Midwest. If you live in this country, you live in a space where there are pollutants that have corrupted the environment, and they create distrust, and they create bigotry, they create presumptions of dangerousness and guilt. And some have argued that at some point these toxins will just dissipate. I don't believe that. We're going to have to do work to clean the environment, to change the environment. And that means we're going to have to talk about things that we haven't talked about before. We're going to actually have to talk about the fact that we live in a post-genocide society. What happened to indigenous people in this country was a genocide. Most students don't even know how many millions of indigenous people were on this land when Europeans came. We don't even teach that. Millions died through famine, through war, through disease. We kept their words, we kept their land, but we made the people leave. Alabama is a native word. These spaces that you're surrounded by are on native words, but we made the people leave. And we created a constitution, we created a Declaration of Independence that had beautiful language and concepts, equality and justice for all, but we didn't apply those concepts to the indigenous people because we said they're different. We created a narrative of racial difference. And while people are taught about the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence, we don't teach them about the narrative of racial difference that we created in this country. Because the only way you can understand why we would round up indigenous people and force them off their lands and subject them to the violence and the trauma and the abuse that they were subjected to is if you understand this narrative of racial difference. And that narrative of racial difference is then what made us comfortable with 2.5 centuries of slavery. And the great evil of American slavery wasn't involuntary servitude. It wasn't forced labor. That was horrific. But the real evil of American slavery was the narrative we created to justify enslavement. Enslavers didn't want to feel immoral or unchristian or unjust, so they had to create a narrative. And the narrative they created, this false narrative, was that black people aren't as good as white people. Black people are less capable. Black people are less worthy, less deserving. And that false narrative undermined the full potential of this nation. And it was the great evil of American history, of American slavery. We fought a civil war, the North won the Civil War, but the South won the narrative war because that idea of racial hierarchy, that idea of white supremacy that was at the heart of that narrative of racial difference, it persisted. Nobody ever talked about ending that. And that's why I've argued that slavery doesn't end in 1865, it just evolved. It gave rise to a century of violence and terror. And the United States Supreme Court was the prime mover in blocking progress. It's the Supreme Court, those decisions in the 1870s. There was a Civil Rights Act in 1870. There was an Anti-Violence Terror Act, the Ku Klux Klan Act in the 1870s. Accommodations, so everything we covered in the 1964 Civil Rights Act had actually been passed a century earlier, but the U.S. Supreme Court said, no, those laws are not enforceable against private citizens. And that's what gave rise to a century of lawlessness and terrorism, and thousands of black people were pulled out of their homes and beaten and drowned, menaced, lynched. Millions of black people fled. And we haven't acknowledged it. That's why that memorial exists, because I think until we reckon with the lawlessness of the first half of the 20th century, until we understand how the demographic geography of this country was shaped by terrorism, we will not appreciate the challenge that we faced. The black people in Cleveland, the black people in Chicago, the black people in Detroit and Oakland and Los Angeles and Minneapolis didn't go to those communities. Many of them, as immigrants looking for new economic opportunities, they went to those communities as refugees and exiles from terror in the American South. 90% of the black population lived in the Deep South at the turn of the 20th century. And they fled to Chicago, they fled to LA, they fled to Oakland, they left land they owned. They gave up the opportunities for wealth, and we have a wealth gap today that is a direct consequence of that forced exodus, that racial terrorism. And older people of color come up to me sometimes, they say, Mr. Stevenson, I get angry when I hear somebody talking about how we're dealing with domestic terrorism for the first time in our nation's history after 9/11. They said, we grew up with terror. We had to worry about being menaced and lynched and bombed our whole lives. And because we haven't reckoned with that, we haven't done what we need to do. And yes, we had a heroic civil rights movement. And I stand on the shoulders of people who did so much more with so much less. But even there, we haven't been honest about the narrative. We've made that period a little Disney-like. You know, I hear people talking about the civil rights movement, and sometimes it sounds like they're describing a 3-day carnival. Day 1, Rosa Parks didn't give up her seat on the bus. Day 2, Dr. King led a march on Washington. Day 3, we passed the civil rights law for racism.
Yeah.
And I wish that were our history. I wish that were true, but that's not true.
That's not true.
That presumption of dangerousness and guilt that was baked in to the narrative of racial difference when Africans came to this country, it was still there. And nobody said or did anything about it. And so that presumption of dangerousness and guilt is still with us. And here we are in 2021, and we are surrounded by spaces, in places, where there's this threat, there's this burden that gets assigned to black and brown people. And you can be a lawyer, you can be a public defender, you can be a social worker, you can even be a judge, you can be kind, you can be loving, you can be a pastor. But if you're black or brown, you will go places in this country where you have to navigate a presumption of dangerousness and guilt. I've argued all of these cases at the U.S. Supreme Court. I argued Jackson v. Hobbs, Miller v. Alabama. I was going around the country representing children who are now entitled to relief because they've been sentenced to life without parole. And I remember going to a courtroom in the Midwest, not the South, to represent some young man. And I show up early. I had my suit and tie on. You know, I tried my very best to kind of help everybody in the courtroom to see me as an advocate, as a lawyer who's entitled to just a little bit. So I get there early, sitting at the defense counsel table, ready to go. And the judge walked in, saw me sitting there, and got angry. He said, hey, you get back out there in the hallway. You wait until your lawyer gets here. I don't want any defendant sitting in my courtroom without their lawyer. And I stood up and apologized. I said, I'm sorry, Your Honor. I didn't introduce myself. My name is Bryan Stevenson. I am the lawyer. And the judge started laughing. And the prosecutor started laughing. And I stood there. And I stood there. And then I made myself laugh too. Because I didn't want to disadvantage my client, who was more vulnerable than I was. And the client came in and we did the hearing. And afterward, I left the court. And I was sitting in my car. I was thinking to myself, here I am, this middle-aged black man, with all of these awards, all of these degrees, argued all of these cases. And I'm still required to laugh at my own humiliation to protect my clients? And what I can tell you, because I'm getting older, is that when you have to constantly navigate these presumptions, when you have to constantly carry this burden, you get tired. And what a lot of us are saying is we're tired. And we don't want to do it anymore. We want to change the narrative. We want to create a new way forward. And that's why that museum and that memorial exists. I believe we have to commit to an era of truth-telling in this country. Yeah. We're going to have to commit to truth and justice. And we can't wait. We can't be distracted. It is urgent and upon us now. When you go to South Africa, you go to an apartheid museum. I went there and I was blown away by it because it is a truth-telling space. And it was part of the Truth and Reconciliation effort to create cultural spaces that made sure that people do not forget the horrors of apartheid. And when I left it, I thought, there are no places like this in America. I went to Berlin. If you go to Berlin, Germany, you can't go 200 meters without seeing markers and stones that have been placed next to the homes of Jewish families. There's a Holocaust memorial in the center of Berlin, and what's fascinating to me is that cab drivers and hotel operators encourage everybody to go to the Holocaust memorial. That nation is reckoning, or trying to reckon, with the history of the Holocaust. And you know what? There are no Adolf Hitler statues in Germany. There are no monuments to the architects of the Holocaust. It'd be unconscionable for someone to say, oh, let's honor the people who killed millions of others in a Holocaust, in a genocide. But we are sitting in a space where the landscape is littered with iconography celebrating the architects of enslavement, the defenders of white supremacy. Alabama has a state holiday. Confederate Memorial Day is a state holiday today. Jefferson Davis's birthday is still a state holiday. We don't have Martin Luther King Day in the state. We have Martin Luther King / Robert E. Lee Day. And that consciousness is very much with us, and that is why the narrative work has to happen now. You see it, this polarized political environment that we are in. People keep thinking, oh, we're past that, we're past that. We're not past anything because we haven't told the truth. And so that is the construct, that is the thinking behind why we felt, as an organization providing legal services to people on death row, legal services to children, legal services to people in jails and prisons, that it was still worth our time to build a museum, to create markers, to create a memorial. And what we're trying to say in that space is that you cannot hide from the truth. You must confront the truth. There has to be truth before we can get to reconciliation. There has to be truth before we get to restoration or redemption. There even has to be truth before we get to repair. Because without the truth, we don't actually know the extent of the damages. There are a lot of lawyers here, and I've been thinking a lot more about how disserved we have been by legal institutions. Because when you go to law school, when you think about it, the curriculum is dominated by remedies. I mean, you take contracts, you take property, you take torts, but most of the conversation is about how you remedy a breach of contract, how you remedy that tort, how you remedy a copyright infringement. It's all about remedies. And the whole legal profession has organized itself to be experts at mediating the remedies necessary when rights have been violated, when wrongs have been committed. And we are very good at that. But the one space where we have never talked about remedies is in the context of civil and human rights. In that context, we just don't think about what the repair should be. And so we passed the Civil Rights Law in 1964, we passed a Voting Rights Law in 1965, and nobody even had to say, yeah, we were wrong to disenfranchise black people for a century. Nobody had to be held accountable. There was no expectation that states would have to repair the damage that was done by a century of disenfranchisement. Even the lynching history, all of those people that are celebrated, honored, recognized in that memorial, they were killed by thousands, none of whom were held accountable. And that framework has to change. And that is the reason why we're talking about repair, reparations, because without a remedy framework, we will not get where we need to go. Our clients, when they are accused of wrongdoing, are held accountable. If you've done parole hearings, you know you can't go into a parole hearing and the client says nothing about the burglary or the robbery. In most of the jurisdictions I practice, if there's no statement of remorse, if there's no statement of, they're not going to get parole. And that's rooted in this idea that we don't trust people who are unwilling to acknowledge the wrongfulness of their conduct, to not repeat that conduct. And that's the country that we live in. Our country has been unwilling to acknowledge the wrongfulness of its conduct. And that leaves us in this space where that conduct continues to be replicated. What we should have done in the 1960s is insist on something reparatory. I don't think it would have been wrong in 1965 to say to black people in Alabama, to say to Alabama, you're now required to register every black person when they turn 18. Black people shouldn't have to register to vote in the state of Alabama. If we were trying to recover from a century of disenfranchisement, that would have been a totally appropriate and consistent remedy given the legal structures that we know. I don't even think it would have been wrong to say, you know what, on election day, Alabama, you need to go to the home of every black registered voter and get their vote. Instead of making them have to go to the polls and navigate all of these hostels, you should go get their vote. I don't even think it would be crazy if they had said, you know, if you're black in Alabama, you get to vote twice so much. I mean, there is precedent for this concept of elevating power and recovery. That's where treble damage is coming from. I haven't said they get to vote 3 times, I'm only asking for twice. But the consciousness behind the need for repair is what's absent, and that is why this narrative shift that we're talking about, that we're trying to create, is so vital. And people sometimes get confused when they hear me. I'm not talking about slavery and lynching and native genocide and segregation and all these terrible things because I want to punish America. I'm not interested in punishment. We're not interested in punishment. We're interested in liberation. We're interested in healthy communities. And that's why I actually am not trying to create burdens that are unjust and unfair for the institutions and systems that have actually perpetrated so much violence and destruction. And it becomes personal, the narrative stuff. I can't tell you the multiple ways in which you can become players in this narrative struggle, but I am here to tell you that you have to do it. We have to talk more broadly. We have to talk more carefully about contextualizing the conditions and the settings and the circumstances that frame our work. We have reports that we just put out, a new race and jury report. There's no area in American law or society more ready for lawyers to push than the area of bias against people of color when they're selected for juries. We're not going to have any expansion of rights during this next few years. The court right now is hostile. We're going to have to work hard to protect the rights we have. But there are lots of rights that we can still enforce that have never been enforced. And we've never really enforced the rights of black people and poor people and other people of color to fully be represented on juries. We just haven't. And so that's why we're saying we have to do that. And that narrative work has to be done by everybody in every way. And it's not easy, but it is necessary. The museum that we created has been a discovery for me. It's been a journey for me. The water feature that we present in the front of that reflects, in many ways, my own kind of discovery about being a person who's the child of enslaved and trafficked and abducted Africans. The first time I went to Africa was just a few years ago. It was in Nigeria, and I was supposed to be in Abuja to give a speech. First time on the African continent. And my plane was late, and I got to Lagos, and a young lawyer was there to meet me. He said, I'm going to get you to the airport the next morning. And he said, but while you're here, let me show you Lagos. And he took me all around the city, and it was like 1 or 2 in the morning. I was really tired. He kept taking me places, and everywhere we would go, he said, he's an American lawyer. He's an American lawyer. People were coming out, and these women were trying to get me to buy shea butter. They said, you don't need the things you don't have the things you need. I bought like 3 gallons of shea butter. And people were so kind, and he just kept, I was so tired. I was trying to be, so let me show you my law office and all of this stuff. And they said, you need some food? I said, no, I think just a little rest. And he's like, I got one more place to take you. And we went to the coast, and there was this beach, and there were these soldiers with machine guns, with these concrete slabs. It wasn't a very attractive beach. He said, come on, I gotta show you something. And we went over to these slabs of concrete. We crawled over, and I just wasn't even sure if this was right, but we crawled over, and we went down, and the next thing I knew, I was standing on the beach, and it was the Atlantic Ocean. Pitch black. It was like 3 or 4 in the morning, and I'm standing there, and that's when this young man turned to me. He said, I brought you here because I wanted to say, I'm sorry, this is where we lost you. And for the first time in my life, I realized I was standing on the other side of the Atlantic Ocean, and that my people had been lost. And all of a sudden, the tears just came. And it caused me to begin to struggle with that body of water that represents so much to the African experience, to the black experience. 2 million people died during the Middle Passage. Their bodies are lying in the seabed of the Atlantic Ocean. And like that 1 out of 3 black kids expected to go to jail or prison, nobody seems to be particularly attentive to their fate. We spend millions of dollars looking for trinkets from the Titanic, and we haven't done anything to memorialize the millions lying at the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean. And so for me, it becomes necessary to elevate that story. And that's why you see that giant screen with all of those waves. And I know it's a little challenging and intimidating, but it is necessary that we begin to reckon with what it means to have abducted abducted people and kidnapped people and trafficked people. We don't care about crime in this country. We allowed millions of black people to be trafficked, and they went to places like Boston and New York City. The Boston Harbor wasn't just where the Tea Party took place that began the American Revolution. It's also where thousands of enslaved people were trafficked. And that reckoning has to happen. I went to Kenya the last time. It was the last time I was in Africa, just a few years back. And I had another one of those experiences. I was there, and when I got off the plane, it was just this sea of smiling black people, and they were all so beautiful. And they were all looking, and it made me feel like, oh, they're all here waiting for me. And of course, they were not waiting for me. They were waiting for somebody else, but they still were so beautiful. I felt so welcome. And I walked past those folks, and they took me to the hotel, and the next day they drove me down to this conference I was supposed to give a speech. All of these human rights lawyers and defenders, and I was so, so moved to be on the African continent. My first time in East Africa, and I was seeing the beauty of the place. I was just walking around a lot, and I don't know, there's just something I felt connected to this space. And it was time for the conference. I was supposed to be one of the last speakers, and they brought me to this room. All of these black lawyers and advocates and judges and teachers and all of these folks. And I was feeling something that I couldn't quite explain, to be honest. And I was about to get up and speak, and something inside my head was saying, don't talk about what you're feeling. This is not safe for that. And I couldn't help it, but I was feeling this, and I'd speak extemporaneously. Sometimes I don't even know what I'm going to say. I was standing there, and all of a sudden, even though I knew I wasn't supposed to, I couldn't help it, but the questions and the thoughts just started coming to me. And looking out over that audience, what I was struggling with was the fact that I am one of the children who were lost to that continent. My people were abducted, were kidnapped, and were taken away. When I looked at that community of people gathered from all over Africa sitting there, I couldn't help it. I know it was unfair. I know it wasn't right, but I couldn't help it. But because I was feeling being lost, I said, I'm one of your lost children. And what I don't understand is why you didn't look for us. Why didn't you come for us? What have you said about us? And it was just a moment of feeling disconnected by a tragedy unaddressed. And in addition to all of the lawyers and the teachers, there were these tall men in white jackets who were the workers at that space. And I'd been seeing them during the course of the day. And as I talked, more of them began gathering in the back of the room. There were like 10 or 11, all wearing their white jackets, all tall, standing in the back. And when I finished the speech, people were very nice and appropriate. But one of these young men walked up to me with his white jacket on, and he said, excuse me, but would you be willing to come and talk with our elder? I said, who is your elder? He said, we're Maasai. We work here. We work in the kitchen. We work in the fields. But our elder is in the back, and we wanted to know if you would come and talk with him. I said, of course. And this man took me back to the room where these tall people were standing with their white jackets, and he said, the elder stepped forward. He said, I'm the elder of our community. And he said, I just want you to know I heard what you said, and I want to affirm the truth of what you said. He said, I don't have the power. I don't have the right. I don't have the authority to claim you. But if I did, believe me, I would. Because I love it when I hear the truth. And in our community, we have a tradition. When people tell the truth, we affirm it. We acknowledge it. And that's when he pulled off his white jacket, and he had on tribal clothing, and his arm were just, he had like 20 bracelets on his arm. He said, when we tell the truth, we acknowledge it with a bracelet. And that man took off one of his bracelets, and he grabbed my arm, and he put it on my wrist. And for 2 years, I couldn't take it off. Couldn't take it off. I cried all the way back from Kenya to Alabama. But it said to me that there is something waiting for us when we take the journey. And that's why that ocean water is there. That's why we want people to walk through that beach and see the legacy of those 2 million abducted. That's why we want people to hear the stories of enslaved people who were traded and trafficked in slave pens. That's why we want people to read the headlines that characterize the mob violence that took so many lives. That's why we want people to see those jars of soil that represent the thousands that were lynched. That's why we want people to read the animus and the hostility and the bigotry that these white leaders were giving in the 1960s and 70s. And that's why we want people to sit down and hear the voices of our clients who are talking about what it's like to be condemned, talking about what it's like to be sentenced as a child. And the power we have is that if we are not afraid of the truth-telling, then we can actually be empowered by it to become truth-tellers. And that's what I think defenders are. I do. That's what I think our work is about. It's about lifting up a fundamental truth about the value and dignity of our clients, the importance of the people who live in our communities, and pushing truth to justice. I do believe that truth and reconciliation, truth and restoration, truth and redemption, truth and reparation, these things are sequential. You can't skip the truth part. A lot of people want to just have reconciliation, just have these other things. It doesn't work like that. I come from a faith tradition, and in my church, you can't come to church and say, oh, I want heaven and salvation and all the good stuff, but I don't want to admit to anything. The preacher's going to tell you it doesn't work like that. They're going to say, no, you have to first confess and repent. There has to be that. And we have to call this nation to account for the ways in which it has been indifferent and silent about this history. And that's what this work is about. The last thing I'll say is that doing this is hard. It is. And we have to be mindful of our hope quotient. I do. I think we have to check it regularly. Because we cannot become hopeless. If we become hopeless, we will become part of the problem. I'm just here to tell you. Our hope is our superpower. Our hope is the thing that gets some of us to stand up even when people say sit down. Our hope is the thing that gets some of us to speak even when people say be quiet. Hope is what gets us into the spaces that are so devastating and challenging and abusive, and yet we are there to be a witness. Hope is powerful. We're in Montgomery. If nothing else, I hope you carry some hope back with you, because you're in a space where for a generation, courageous black people would put on their Sunday best, and they would go places to push this nation toward justice, and they knew before they got there that when they got there, they were going to get beaten and battered and bloodied, and they still went. They had enough hope to endure the suffering and the abuse of a system that did not care about their basic security, and yet they fought. And that is what has to sustain us as we do this work. And then the last thing I'm persuaded we have to do is that we have to be willing to do things that are uncomfortable, because there is no path to justice that allows us to only do the comfortable things, the convenient things. I know it's come up throughout your conversations during this conference, but there is no path that allows us to avoid the uncomfortable. And I know, particularly in this moment, as we're recovering from this pandemic, as we're recovering from a lot of things that are going on around the world, it's easy, it's hard to do the uncomfortable. It is. I told you about that little boy. We got that young boy that I was mentioning out of that jail, and we got him released, and he went on to graduate from high school. He graduated from college. He has an engineering degree. He has a beautiful family, and he was released on the 3rd of the month. And on the 3rd of every month, that young man calls me up, and he just says, Mr. Bryan, I'm doing great, and I love you. And it may seem silly, but those calls are like, I don't know, they're priceless to me. And I've been getting them for years now. And that is the power also in this dynamic. There's so much that we face. There's so much that we confront. And there's so much that will make us uncomfortable. But we have to fight through that. We created that memorial. And when we created that memorial, it was hard. We didn't have the money. We didn't have a lot of things that people have. We did it really quickly because we felt that it was urgent. And I will admit to you that it was unbelievably stressful to kind of figure out how to do something. We got no support. We didn't take any government money for any of our sites. I say take any government money. We were never offered any government money. But we wouldn't have taken it even if they offered it. And so it was really hard, really hard. People kept saying, well, you don't know anything about museums. You don't know anything about memorial. Why would we give you money to do something? You don't have any experience like that. It was hard. It was challenging. And when we opened the sites, we had 25,000 people come. We weren't sure anybody would come. And I saw people at the memorial weeping because they saw a family name on the county that their people fled from. I saw people embracing one another. There was this affirmation that I have to tell you has really encouraged me. And we had a dedication service at the memorial on the morning of the opening, and I was very concerned about rain because you've just come from over there. You know that there's a part of it that's enclosed, but most of it is outdoors, and I didn't want the rain to mess up this experience. And we had great weather until that morning, and sure enough, clouds got gray, sky got dark. We got everybody inside, hundreds of people, and we had a beautiful service, but right before I was supposed to speak, it just seemed like the clouds opened up, and it started pouring down rain. And this thing I'd been dreading the entire time had finally come. I was first like, oh my God, this is just awful. And I sat there listening to that rain hit the top of that memorial, and all of a sudden, my relationship to that memorial shifted in ways that it hasn't shifted back. I was sitting there listening to the rain, it was hitting the top, and this thing I'd been dreading all of a sudden became something welcome. Because in that moment, it didn't sound like the raindrops were hitting the top of the memorial. It sounded like these thousands of people whose names had never been spoken, whose names had never been recognized, were finally being honored in ways that caused them to shed tears of joy. And that's the thing I want you to hold on to. There is a joy in being truth tellers. There is a power in being truth. I get a little bit of pleasure pushing people to recognize that each of us is more than the worst thing we've ever done. I know it's hard, but it actually empowers me when I can go into spaces and say, none of us is the worst thing we've ever done. If someone tells a lie, they're not just a liar. If someone takes something, they're not just a thief. If someone kills somebody, they're not just a killer. I actually get joy in pushing our society to recognize that the opposite of poverty isn't wealth. The opposite of poverty is justice, and those who are doing justice are deconstructing the conditions that make poverty real. And there is joy in being part of this long history of people who have struggled. I'm the great-grandson of people who were enslaved. My great-grandfather learned to read while enslaved in the 1850s because he believed one day he'd be free. Nothing about Virginia would have made it rational to believe that he'd be free, but he believed it. My grandmother fled the Deep South for Philadelphia, had 10 children. I used to say, Mama, why'd you have 10 children? She said, because I had so much love to give that I wanted to make sure I gave it all before God was finished with me. My mom was the youngest of her 10 kids. We grew up poor in a poor rural section. And my mother bought the World Book Encyclopedia for her children. I never will forget it. I was about 8 years old. My friends were getting baseballs and basketballs and bicycles. We got the World Book Encyclopedia. But my mother went into debt to buy those books because she wanted us to see a world bigger than the ghetto village that we lived in. And because of that, I had these imaginations. And I feel the strength, I feel the power of all of those people, black and white and other, who have stood against the lash of slavery, who have stood for the struggle for justice. And we are part of that legacy. We are their descendants. We are their heirs. And we have to hold on to that. We have to embrace that. We have to celebrate that. But more than that, we have to take it back to our communities. Stay proximate to the poor and the condemned. Change these narratives. Remain hopeful, and do the uncomfortable and inconvenient but necessary work of creating a just society. I want to celebrate all of you who are doing that, who will continue to do that. And again, thank you for coming to spend time with us here in Montgomery. I hope you'll come back, and we look forward to seeing you again. Thank you all.